Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Caring about mental health is often regarded as a privilege, as opposed to a fundamental human need. But various scientific and medical research has proven otherwise. The Lancet Commission report released in 2018 made an alarming observation. Mental health disorders are on the rise in every country in the world. And if this is not taken seriously, this could cost the global economy up to $16 trillion. There's no denying that there are a plethora of factors that have made modern life extremely demanding and volatile. This has led to an increase in stress levels. But we often see stress as benign as opposed to something that actively eats us from the insides. On tonight's show, we discuss why we need to take our stress and anxiety levels seriously and what can be done to work through them. Joining us for the discussion today is Dr. Mohammad Ather, who is a psychiatrist joining us from Doha. We're also joined by Ms. Tooba Fatima, who's a psychotherapist at Mind Professionals, joining us from Lahore. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Mohammad Ather, let me begin with you. So I mentioned here briefly how it is being recorded that stress levels are not being taken seriously enough. But could you brief us on how, with the busy environment in the modern age, stress levels are in fact rising?
Okay, let me start with what is stress. Actually, stress is a way our body responds to the challenges. Stress could be positive and productive, but I think we are talking about the counterproductive stress. And as every day we are faced up with excessive demands, our body may react, physiological body and psychologically, we can react in a way which can be counterproductive to the work itself as well as to our body.
Yeah. And doctor, you mentioned here how stress can be positive. Let's touch upon that a little more. What do you mean by that exactly? And to what degree should we say that stress can be positive to when it enters the more damaging realm?
Say if you are given a challenge and our normal response is to get stressed when we are presented with a challenge. And you may react in a way that you search the article, you develop the skill, and you deal with the challenge. So it would be a productive one.
Yeah.
But we all have limitations, physiological as well as psychological. If we are presented with a challenge which is above our capacities, then obviously psychologically and physiologically, when we cannot cope with it, so our body and mind gonna respond in a way which will not be healthy, which will be negative and counterproductive.
Yeah. And doctor, here, could you distinguish between stress and anxiety as well?
Stress can result into a number of presentations. One of them is anxiety. Anxiety is, if you take it a medical definition of the anxiety, it is an unnecessary worry and worrying too much for irrational things or irrational reasons. When it is stress is a name we use to describe literally everything, and actually it's been taken as like a stress is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So anxiety is basically an illness, but stress can be productive, stress can be counterproductive.
Yeah. Doctor, I'm going to put Tooba here as well. Tooba, the doctor told us about the various types of stresses and how it can be positive in some cases, but also counterproductive. When we talk about counterproductive stress, how does that impact mental health exactly? Could you take us through it? And what happens to people who already suffer from other mental illnesses, for instance, depression?
I think I very much agree with the doctor that, all human emotions, if you experience them in sort of like a healthy spectrum, they are meant to help us. For example, if you've got an exam coming up and you're not stressed about it, you're not anxious about it at all, you may not invest the time that you need to, ace that exam.
Yeah.
But let's say that you're spending so much time worrying about giving the exam that you no longer have, the capacity to actually study for the exam. Then at that point, the stress or the anxiety is actually harming you. So I would say that at any point when any emotion begins to negatively impact your functionality, the way that you relate to other people. For example, some people can experience a lot of anxiety when they're speaking with other people or are in large groups. Now, if we allow that anxiety to build, or if we do not address that anxiety, people might find themselves, cutting themselves off from social events, or, not being able to meet their friends. And I think, stress in particular impacts human beings in many, many different ways. There's some very interesting studies on anger, for example, which observe how when human beings are angry, there's less oxygen in the front of our brain, which is the part of our brain that is basically involved in logic and rational thinking.
Yeah.
So anger and stress very literally reduces our capacity to be able to think, to be able to, take stock of
function
what it
in a
is that we
productive
should be
manner.
doing. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So not only physically, but also, I think, of course, feeling anxious just feels bad. Emotionally, it feels bad. It makes us feel like we can't cope with life. And that in itself is not a good feeling.
And Tooba, I do want to discuss, we should have a conversation regarding stress and anxiety without trivializing it, without making it sound benign. But before that, in order to emphasize on that point, I'd like to ask Dr. Muhammad Ather, the physical aspects, the physical problems that result due to stress. Chronic stress, we have heard many times, can raise blood pressure, can lead to cardiovascular diseases. Tell us more about that. How, when we are in a constant state of chronic stress or anxiety, that impacts the organs from inside?
So when you are stressed, you get into the flight or fight mood. So your heart beats fast. So you become tachycardic. You start breathing faster, which is not helpful, as Dr. Tooba was saying. So you breathe fast, actually you get less oxygen. And then your muscles become tense. And this all, the equation, it makes you even more stressed and more angry.
Yeah.
And if the stress is prolonged, you're continuously going and living under stress, these may result into the real mental illness, for example, like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorders.
Yeah.
So all these disorders can result into it.
Yeah. There are also studies that found that people suffering in very high stress environments, their lifespan might decrease. There was a study released in the Lancet Diabetes and a journal which stated this, which talked about how it might reduce a man's lifespan 68% if they're living in very, very high stressful environments. So, of course, the physical manifestations are tremendous when we're talking about this. Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad Ather, for joining us and talking to us about this. Tooba, while we're continuing about this discussion, something I want to touch upon about the fact is, how do we discuss stress and anxiety without trivializing it, without making it sound like something that is not that big of an issue? We hear many people talk about it in this way. Recently, the founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, made a statement that working long hours is productive, not taking into account the fact that it leads to greater stress as well. So when we have this sort of a discourse, how do we counter it?
I think a very important thing to understand about the human body is that, yes, of course, the environment has an impact on how stressed we're feeling or how anxious we're feeling. But human beings are also biochemical beings, right? So sometimes something in the chemical makeup can cause people to feel disproportionately anxious or disproportionately sad.
Yeah.
And it's important to realize in that moment that then it's not just about, sort of making an effort or, just like having the right mindset. It's really about the fact that that something is sort of off in the way in which the human brain is processing information, and that person needs help. They are doing the best that they can. And we sort of have to look at it, if somebody, Allah na kare, has like a fever, or are really ill, we don't ask them to just make themselves feel better. We understand that they are debilitated and we get them the help that they need. So I think it is very important to understand that when someone's functionality is being seriously affected by, whether it's about stress or anxiety or loss or grief or trauma, whatever it is.
Yeah. Tooba, I take your point there. You're saying that there needs to be a great amount of sensitivity in trying to understand someone's position. Also related to this, I want to understand how people react differently under perhaps the same situation. You mentioned here how the reaction of the body might be different for someone, might feel extreme sadness or might feel extreme anxiety. In this case, how would you say people react differently?
I think there's a wide range of ways in which people can react, right? And that depends on a lot of different factors. So for example, let's say somebody has a sort of a genetic predisposition for a certain mental illness. Even if the environment introduces a small amount of stress, it would sort of blow up compared to somebody who's not burdened with having that in their genes, and they could probably tolerate a larger amount of stress. And I also want to...
Yeah, sorry, continue.
I just want to say that I also want to just mention that, the need to take care of our mental health and mental well-being, it's sort of the same as taking care of, our normal health, and that we don't just have to wait for it to get really, really bad in order to take care of ourselves, in order to take care of our mental health.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have a diagnosable condition to go see somebody like me. Even if you're just going through a rough patch, you're looking for, just somebody to offer you support or somebody to help you through a difficult time in your life. It doesn't have to be a crisis for you to reach out for help.
Hold on to that thought, Tooba. We're also now joined by another guest, Miss Geetanjali Kumar, who's a counseling psychologist, a life coach, and a motivational speaker, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you so much, Miss Geetanjali, for joining us. Let me ask you this. We were talking about how there are ways to manage stress and anxiety in these high stressful environments. What can you tell us about that? How would you tell people to cope with those stresses?
Rather than coping with the stress first, rather than just learning, we all will have to learn to identify the stress trigger first. What causes me the stress?
Yeah.
When do I get anxious, or when do I get angry? When do my temperatures flare up? So the first and the foremost thing would be to identify the triggers which exist in the life of an individual. That could be a family pressure, that could be a toxic relationship, that could be some demands of the job, that could be a faulty lifestyle pattern, that could be a nutritional deficiency. So what is it that is bothering me?
Yeah.
That is something, that kind of a state of mindfulness where every human being is able to connect to his inner core and perhaps find discover that there is something missing in the inner core.
Yeah. Something that's disrupting a person from within, they need to identify that cause. But Ms. Geetanjali, we know, of course, that there are often many exogenous factors, many external factors that cannot be controlled, even if a person identifies them as being the cause of aggravating them and causing much stress. In those cases, how does the mind work? How does the mind work to reconcile what cannot be changed with what the person needs to do to overcome that issue?
To be very honest, I feel it is again a state of mindfulness again a state of heightened awareness where the person is able to create a disconnected connect with the circumstances, where he is able to shift himself or herself out from that situation, view the situation as a spectator, get a hang of the situation, take a stock of things, identify what lies within his control, within her control, and what is beyond their control.
Yeah.
So if we are able to create that kind of flow statement for ourselves, a compare and contrast to the situation in terms of what I can do and what are things beyond change.
Yeah. And for Ms. Geetanjali, you mentioned here reaching into a state of mindfulness. What can you tell us about that? We know that in these environments, the mind is often cluttered with so many ideas, with so many competing thoughts. How does one reach a state of mindfulness?
Mindfulness is a very beautiful state of inner peace and calmness. It is simply to be in the now of the moment. So if I can live my life with every breath, in every breath, I can feel the moment. Simply like sipping a glass of water, it is actually the acknowledgement of holding the glass with the fingers. It is the transmission of the feeling of that glass in terms of the coldness of the water. It's going to quench my thirst. It is anticipation along with experiencing. And it is finally living that experience within oneself.
And Ms. Geetanjali, would you say that the state of overthinking is directly opposing the state of mindfulness?
I really wouldn't say that it is only overthinking. It is thinking of very many things, not of one thing in particular, in depth. It is diverse thinking. It is cluttering of the mind. The thoughts are not connected or based on one issue only.
Yeah.
There is too much in my mind.
Yeah.
So many kind of thinking.
Yeah, and Ms.
Each
Geeta,
one of us as an individual has got high aspirations, and some of them could be unrealistic aspirations.
Yeah. And Ms. Geetanjali, when we're talking about this and behavioral patterns, there are often circumstances and many people who live in abysmal conditions that cannot be changed. What do you think they can do? We have been talking about reaching a state of mindfulness, but when you are in the darkest pit, what do you think needs to be done in order to train your mind in helping yourself out of that situation?
There's a very beautiful prayer that says, give me the serenity to know what can be changed and to accept what cannot be changed. So somewhere that kind of an honest evaluation of situation, one.
Yeah.
Two, moving out of that heated situation, getting away from the triggers, and then perhaps taking few deep breaths, coming back in control of oneself, and then taking a stock of things and trying to make amends of the situation.
Yeah.
And acceptance, an honest acceptance of the situation.
So hold on to that thought, Ms. Geetanjali. I want to ask Tooba about something previously we were talking about as well. Tooba, before we talked to Ms. Geetanjali about the power of the mind, I was asking you, what do you think prevents people from reaching out and seeking help, especially when it comes to mental health?
I think there still remains sort of a lot of stigma surrounding mental health, and particularly who goes to a therapist, who needs a therapist. Yeah. And very much still this idea persists that, only someone who is severely ill would need to go to a therapist, and that is false. A therapist is someone who is there to help you through difficult patches of your life.
Yeah.
You do not need to have a diagnosable condition. You do not need to be having a breakdown to take care of your mental health. And I think particularly because in our country, we are a very connected society. It's really important because, it's difficult for a lot of kids, a lot of young adults to go to therapy if their families are not on board, if their families and if their parents fail to recognize or fail to acknowledge that it's important for their kids to have their own space where they can work through their own issues. So I think that acknowledgement and that support as well. I think there's also sort of a dearth of qualified therapists in our country that needs to be addressed. And I hope that people understand that there is a real need for
and Tooba, isn't this the case
mental health?
And isn't this the case for the global community as well? Because research suggests that even in more developed countries, there are only 70 to 100,000 people, 70 counselors for 100,000 people. So globally, do you think people and countries and communities are investing enough in mental care services?
Absolutely not. You're absolutely right that globally is that there is a sort of need that the sheer volume of people who require this kind of help, there aren't sort of enough again well-trained people who are able to work with them. So I hope that people out there hopefully listening are able to understand. When I was choosing to go into this field, something that I heard a lot was who goes to people like this? Like, nobody goes to a therapist. Like, where are you going to find work? I have had great difficulty taking on new clients. I continue to have great difficulty referring clients to others because most of the good therapists I know are booked for months. And there are people, who have to be on wait lists for months. So rest assured that there is a real need and there is a real space in the job market, again, for well-trained, well-qualified mental health workers.
And Tooba, do you think that there is an urgency in the environment right now? We hear about so many suicides taking place. Do you think there is an urgency for people to take this seriously now more than ever before?
I think that urgency develops when we continue to ignore something for a very, very long time. So for example, how many college campuses offer counseling services to their students? How many schools and institutions are investing in their students' mental health? And so the opportunity, when there isn't adequate opportunity to intervene at a less severe stage, it is then we will, sort of continue to see these very, very unfortunate, more severe cases unfold because no one was able to intervene in time. So, stress has been around for ages. And in our day and age, it's really, yes, there might be more stress. It's just that we have different stressors. It's stress and anxiety and mental health and mental illness have been part of the human experience since as long as there have been human beings. I think if we're seeing sort of like this uptick on people who are suffering more, it's, again, like I said, because we haven't set up enough structures. And I want to just add something really small, that as important it is for us to be able to understand that individually there are ways in which we can cope with mental health and mental illness, ways in which, we can use the mind and our human resources to combat things that are happening to us. We also have to acknowledge that it is the responsibility of systems to mend themselves as well. So if there is poverty that is creating stressors for people, if school environments and work environments are so stressful that they're compromising the mental health and well-being of the people who work for them, so those systems also have to be held accountable, and we have to understand.
And Tooba, the very strong point you made there, and we're going to take a short break, but after we return, we do want to talk about how society expects individuals to be stoic, how they expect them to not face and acknowledge these stressors, and they think of them as occurring in routine, which is wrong. But before that, we have to take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Mr. Akhtar Ali Syed, who's a clinical psychologist joining us from Ireland. Mr. Akhtar, let me ask you this. Sometimes we don't identify the state our body is in. Does that happen when we're stressed out? Is it possible to be stressed out and anxious and be unaware of the fact that that's the state we are in?
Yes, it is very possible. We should remember that one of the symptoms of some, higher stages or higher levels of anxiety is numbness. Numbness is a state where we are detached from our thinking and what is going on inside the body. So we are detached from that. And that is very possible that we don't understand what is going on, what is impacting on our mind, and what is impacting on our body. So this is very possible, yes.
So what is the way forward then? How do people recognize in that state of numbness that they are experiencing such a high level of stress or anxiety?
First of all, the major thing is that we need to understand what generally causes that state of numbness for us. It is recognizable because if you just categorize the sources of stress and anxiety for each person, so there are mainly two sources. One is the environment, socio-political and cultural and economic environment, which could cause anxiety and stress for us. And then the second one is our interaction with other people. So they are the two main sources where the anxiety or stress would generally come from. So if we can identify that what is causing anxiety or stress for us, so then it is very easy to understand it, and it is easy for us not to go into the state of numbness, and we can address the anxiety before we get numb.
Yeah. And Dr. Akhtar, something I want to ask you is that in general and everyday discourse, we often hear that we have become, as a society, more and more apathetic to tragedies. And we assume that it's because we remain unaffected by them. But do you think that when a person is living in a high stress environment, that impacts the mind subconsciously, even if the person is not aware of it?
It is very possible. I recently wrote an article which was published in an English daily in Pakistan, and I was trying to highlight the stresses in the Pakistani society which have gone unidentified, unaddressed, and we felt that we are very resilient and we ignored those incidents which were causing that level of stress. And it is quite possible that a society generally starts ignoring those incidents which could be the source of trauma and stress for us.
Yeah, and I want to bring Ms. Geetanjali into this conversation as well. Ms. Geetanjali, what is the power of our subconscious? How does it give us a signal that we are in a very high-stressed situation, or that we are suffering from some sort of anxiety, even if we're not unaware of it?
It is actually the acknowledgement. It is actually the feel of that moment. It is how I view my well-being. The sense of irritation, irritability that sets in, the thresholds decrease, something which I would have tolerated in any other situation. Now I am unable to. It is basically carrying on that sulking moment for long. It starts affecting the appetite, it starts affecting the sleep, it starts affecting your day-to-day activity. All this is enough an acknowledgement that all is not well with an individual.
Yeah, and Ms. Geeta, hold on to that. Tooba, I want to ask you, when we are talking about all of this, it's of course, it talks about all of this premising on the fact that we need to be aware of our bodies and what our mind is telling us. But do you feel that we have been placed under a pressure, under the immense amount of pressure to be very stoic and stolid and not feel emotions in this regard? You were mentioning earlier how there are toxic work environments, many different toxic cultures, and then people are expected not to be impacted by them.
Absolutely. You know, I think the world over, a lot of times we don't really invest in giving ourselves and giving the people around us an adequate emotional vocabulary, which they could then use to identify how they're feeling, and which they could then use to identify, when are the times when they need an intervention, when they need help.
Yeah.
So we really do need sort of more of an openness towards feeling our feelings. We need to understand that, one really common misconception that I've heard a lot, for example, is that if you want to make a good choice, if you want to make a rational choice, you've got to ignore your emotions. That is not true. Our emotions, give us a really good sensor of how we feel about certain people or certain situations, or how we're going to feel if we make a certain choice.
Yeah.
The more that we try to fight with our emotions, the more that we do not have a conversation with our emotions and don't give them room, the more problematic they become, because they can't disappear. You can't make your emotions go away. You have to be able to process them. So I believe from
and Tooba, sorry to interrupt you there, but you made a very interesting point, and I'd like you to expand upon that. Our emotions are like sensors. They give us senses of people who we should stay away from, and many other things. How strong is the sixth sense in this regard? Just tell us briefly about that.
I wouldn't even call it a sixth sense. Our emotions are hardwired into us as human beings. They're part of our system. They're not just they're not just there to get in the way of our functioning. I was talking in the beginning about, if you do not feel anxiety about an upcoming task, you're not going to invest in it.
Yeah.
How do you know that you want to spend time with someone? Because you get a good feeling about them. How do you know when some place or some person is sort of being toxic for you and you want to get away from them? Your emotions let you know, right? You might feel something change in your self-esteem, or just how you feel about yourself. You might feel more just negative emotions. So our emotions are a rich source of information, and if we are able to connect with them, if we're able to feel them, and the important thing is that not just the good ones. It's not just about feeling happy and feeling content all the time. We've got to understand that sorrow and stress and grief and loss are all part of the normal human range of emotions.
Yeah. And Tooba, hold on to that thought. We're going to that point forward. But before that, I want to ask Ms. Geetanjali, what do you think is the positive role the community, the families, the friends of the person who is highly anxious, depressed, or stressed out need to play? What needs to be a societal role that is played in this regard?
The family and the society can play an immense positive role in helping the person overcome the stress. As we talked about emotional numbness, perhaps emotional numbness can melt, or they can help melting away that numbness, help the person identify, admit, confess, realize that he or she is in some stress. And how, because there is, at times with a lot of people, there is a huge sense of denial. I think I am okay, everything is fine with me, everything is fine in my life, is also kind of denial. So maybe the close family, loved one, community can help dispel this denial, accept the situation, realize what is in my control and what is not in my control, and then how to work for things which are in my control. Maybe talking it out, what bothers me, how it bothers me, because in that state of stress where your cognitive abilities can also be compromised at times, emotions are very important, but emotions at times fog your state of thinking. So somewhere we are able to look at the situation objectively, find out how we are being affected and what is affecting us. So an important critical analysis of the situation, identifying one's own skill set, how does one help oneself, building up one's own resilience and a problem-solving attitude.
Yeah, and Ms. Geetanjali, you definitely provide us a different perspective and point of view than what Tooba told us, and both are important in this regard. Thank you so much, Ms. Geetanjali, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Akhtar Ali, I'd like to talk about something related to children here. Children often don't express their emotions the ways adults do. But here we often note and we have heard that children's behavioral patterns need to be identified by parents. When they're stressed out, that could be a symptom of a larger problem. It could be abuse or bullying. What can you tell us about this? What do parents need to be on the lookout if their children are bothered?
First of all, children are showing more signs of anxiety and depression than ever before. So it is very important for schools and families to note that down, that the stressors are high for children now than ever before. Because sometimes, the parents feel that such things were not bothering us when we were children.
Yeah.
So they feel that their children should not be bothered by those triggers. So that is not a fair way of looking at the problems now, because we are living in a different era, first of all. The second thing is that we have to differentiate the signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression among children from some behavioral issues or being over-demandingness. Because when parents leave this one extreme, they go on to the other extreme. They start fulfilling all the demands being made by children without even asking a question. Okay, so now as far as the signs of stress and anxiety are concerned, so what we have to see the interaction of a child with others, with his or her peers, with his or her family members. One. Second thing is the academic performance.
And Mr. Akhtar, just moving back a little, what do you mean that we need to observe how their interaction is? What would be the red flags there?
Yeah, so if we notice a drastic change in the general pattern of interaction. For example, if the child was very sociable, very amicable, very affable generally, but if we start noticing a change that the child is isolating himself or herself, child is a bit irritable in the general interaction and making complaints. So this should be noticeable by the parents. So this is as far as the interaction is concerned. Then the cycle of sleep. The child might be sleeping at odd times and might be awake when he was supposed to sleep. The behavior in the school, generally, we get reports from school where the child was a little different than what he or she was before.
Yeah.
And then crying spells is more often seen even where we work. So we would have the cases where parents would report that the child is crying. And very alarmingly, what we are seeing in this part of the world, that the children are being referred to us with obsessive compulsive disorder, which was not generally being diagnosed in the childhood, but now more increasingly the children are being diagnosed.
And what do you think
obsession.
the reasons are here, Mr. Akhtar? Because you mentioned that children are now more depressed and anxious than ever before. What are the main causes that you have identified?
Number of reasons. But, the main problem here in this part of the world, I can talk to you about the causes in Pakistan as well, but main reason here, what we are seeing is the attachment problem. Children here are being reared up by single-parent families. After, divorce or separation, either dad is gone or mom is gone. Mostly the dad is gone.
Yeah.
And then, the child is being reared up by the mother. And that is a very difficult situation emotionally, not practically, but emotionally it is a very difficult situation.
Yeah.
And these attachment issues would cause a lot of problems here in this part of the world. But in Pakistan, what we didn't try to understand that the current political and law and order situation, how it is impacting the children. How, for example, when they go to the school and they see the armed guards outside of their school, they're not allowed to go outside of the school. So their play times are restricted, and general environment of anxiety and stress.
Mr. Akhtar,
that might be the reason.
Mr. Akhtar, sorry to interrupt you there, but I just want to ask you one last question before we let you go. Is this a misconception that children are not cognizant, young children are not cognizant of what's going on around them? Because you mentioned here that attachment issues in single-parent households, it's often assumed that if parents separate when the child is very young, the child might not be as badly affected. But is this a misconception?
It was a big fallacy. It was not a misconception. I think you are using a very small word for that.
Yeah.
It is a big fallacy on our part. The child starts noticing the environment when he or she is still in his mother's womb. Emotionally, now, I'm not talking about physiologically, but emotionally, the child is being impacted by what mother goes through. Yes.
Yeah. And thank you so much for talking to us that and shedding light on to that perspective, Mr. Akhtar Ali Syed. Tooba, moving on to you, do you think that when you heard what Mr. Akhtar was talking about, that children are now much more depressed than ever before, do you think that this is being taken seriously enough?
Well, I would certainly say no. I think one of the most discouraging pieces of news that I've recently heard is that, because of the sort of financial restructuring that's going on for our school systems these days, a lot of school counselors have been fired.
Yeah.
I'm seeing multiple people who, had access to a free and private therapist in their school who was suddenly removed. So certainly, it's clear that when it came to really deciding what we don't value or what we could afford to let go of, we chose to let go of the people who looked after our mental health and our well-being.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to say that your mental health is real, and it has a real documentable impact on your physiological health, your emotional health, your mental health. And if you feel like you are struggling, you have the right to seek help.
And Tooba, here, let me ask you this. How important is early intervention when we're talking about all these issues? Can it help prevent the child from growing into an adult suffering from all these problems?
Absolutely. Of course, if you intervene at a time when either a problem is not as severe or, someone is given an opportunity to resolve something sooner rather than later, it helps. But I do want to say that, human beings are incredibly resilient, and whether they are able to access help sooner or later in their childhood or in their adulthood, we are able to heal parts of ourselves, even parts of ourselves that have been severely wounded a very, very long time ago.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about early intervention, yes, it has to do with sort of mental health intervention, but also if you create an environment where a child grows up in a healthy emotional environment, is taught how to recognize and deal with their emotions, are given space for their emotions, and just, then that is also a kind of intervention, that there aren't enough stressors around someone that it would get to that point. Where
and Tooba, I've noted down that point how important early intervention is in this case. We're also joined by Mr. Van Meguerditchian, who is a journalist joining us from Paris. Thank you so much, Van, for joining us. Van, now you as a journalist work in a profession that is very, very highly stressful. Tell us, as a professional, how do you cope with that stress?
Hey, thanks for having me to begin with. Listen, it's a day-to-day challenge that one definitely needs to find creative solutions for it. it's either you beat it, or you're overwhelmed and you give up at some point.
Yeah.
There are, most of us in this profession, for example, what we are mainly practically every day-to-day issues we face is that we discuss between colleagues, that we talk about, that we try to have big meetings about it and try to campaign to have a better standard of work environment and standard of living, etc. It's mainly because of what time we are working. A journalist doesn't have a time. A journalist doesn't go into work at 10 and leaves at 5 p.m.
Yeah.
In the evening. What we face is the rules that a country applies on a company, and how a company fits itself within the country's rules. This profession, you can go home at 8, you can go home at 10 in the evening, and then all of a sudden on your phone you have a new email that you need to answer to. Do you answer or you do not? There's a big question. The big debate going on at the moment here in Paris.
Yeah. And Van, let me ask you the same question, but from a different angle. Now, you, as a journalist, deal with many human interest stories, I'm sure, and many that are heartbreaking. And you absorb the trauma that you hear or read about, and you move on. But I'm sure that impacts you as a person on a personal level and as a journalist. Now, what needs to be done about that? What does the journalist community say about that?
Whenever I talk about this, whenever I think about this issue, it's more common than you think it can be. Every single day when we are confronted with a story like this, let's say there's a explosion in a neighborhood, and in a few minutes I have to be there, or a colleague of mine has to be there on the field to cover. A journalist is not someone who is going there to save lives. Do you save a life, or do you report on that? A journalist has to report on that. A journalist should stand away from emotions. A journalist needs to report facts as they see. It's not his job to go and save lives during a battle. It's not a journalist's job to intervene and say who is right and who is wrong. A journalist needs to report the facts. If we keep doing what we are supposed to do, then I think it would be a better service for our communities and our countries. Yeah.
And with that, you mentioned that a journalist, when they go cover issues, they're there to save lives. But also, in many instances, journalists' own lives are at stake, especially when they're covering conflict zones. In those cases, what do you think is done to deal with that pressure, deal with that stress?
Well, a lot of us listen. There is no way to define this, but a journalist is just another person on the street. Let me give you an example. Yesterday evening, we were about to lose one of the biggest icons of France. We were about to lose one of the biggest icons of Paris. What actually Paris historically is has been around Notre Dame Cathedral that is located on the River Seine, and a lot of journalists who were nearby, they were just as shocked to see this cathedral in flames, and just as other people on the street. Now, a journalist at the same time has to deal with what he has to do, his emotions, take care of his emotions, document this, communicate with his colleagues back in an office, in the newsroom. How do they deal with it? We just have to deal with it. It's part of a day-to-day job, and then it's all about communicating. It's all about sitting down after work, sitting down with colleagues, sitting down with friends, taking it easy and talking about this, talking about it with friends, discussing what happened, how we felt. A journalist should not hide his feelings. A journalist, perhaps I would in my opinion, a journalist should hide their feelings when they are writing about an event. Yes, that would be an ideal thing. But a journalist is just another human being. They should share their feelings with their friends after work.
And that's a great message that you're giving, Van, and I think that goes across for all professions and all communities and all people, that they do need to express and communicate what they are feeling, because at the end of the day, everyone is just a human who absorbs a number of different stresses and risks and many different emotions. Thank you so much, Van, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you so much, Ms. Tooba Fatima, for joining us and talking to us. Thanks for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.